Welcome to everyone who's joined us this evening. It is a real shame that obviously we aren't meeting in person and in Parliament where this event was originally scheduled. This is an event which is hosted in partnership with Bell Ribeiro-Addy and is launching a report that we have worked on for some time now. It's been kind of in inception for over a year, but colleagues on this call have contributed to the final report over the last 6 months. And we are really happy to share this report and to add to the conversation. The report itself was enabled by funders, our kind of very generous funders, Barrow Cadbury Trust and Joseph Rowntree Foundation, who have funded this work and have funded work around economic justice for a long time and are loyal to that cause. I guess I wanted to start by kind of saying something around why this report and why now, because I think that none of us can escape the reality of where we're at currently and where the kind of political conversation is. I think that many of us feel like we're living in a dystopian reality and a really frightening time where the level of racism that we are witnessing is something that I don't think I've ever witnessed in my lifetime. I think we have seen a rampant racism that has become normalized, that has become legitimized, and that has been actively encouraged by mainstream political actors, including politicians and the media. And I think that for so many of us, people of colour in this country, we have been robbed of our sense of security, of our sense of safety, and certainly of our sense of belonging. And so I think in this context, it can feel incongruent, it can feel kind of dissonant that why are we talking about reparations when it feels like the world is on fire? And I would argue that actually that is exactly why we should be talking about reparations, and it is exactly why this is so urgent. I think that so much of the current narrative relies on an erasure and a distortion of our histories and an understanding of who this country is and why this country is the way it is. And so it is exactly the time for this conversation, because I think the different chapters that are commissioned and part of this report talk not just about how reparations is about past or how the past has inscribed the present, but it is very much about who gets to write the future and how do we get to shape and curate what that future looks like. And I think it's really important that so much of the conversation or underlying the kind of the ugly racism that we are seeing currently is underpinned by the wealth inequalities that are kind of are apparent and which have widened and which are through policy design. And I think that we need to understand those economic inequalities. We need to understand the deprivation, but we also need to understand the racist ideologies that underpin and justify those inequalities. And this report goes some way toward doing that. And so I think that this report speaks to the fact that reparations aren't some kind of fantastical idea. They're not just some principled abstract idea. They are kind of, it's a real conversation. These are the chapters that form part of this report all speak to not just the moral value or the principled need to address these issues. It talks about how this is happening in the here and now. These are realities. These are conversations that are impactful now. And so I would argue that this report in many ways is a refusal to accept and obey the terms of reference that we're given by this very narrow conversation currently, and is an opportunity for us to write towards and work towards a future that is entirely different. So with that in mind, I have to thank all of the contributors who have contributed to the reports, helped to shape the thinking that's gone into Runnymede as an organisation and the work that we will take forward from this report as well. I'll hand back to Keon.
Thank you so much, Shabna. I really do appreciate that. I think this report, for me, has been a real turning point. It's been a privilege to work on it. And it made me realize something quite fundamental. I don't think of myself as a poorly informed person. I think of myself as a fairly well-informed person. I am, after all, the head of research at the Runnymede Trust. I have done research on racism and on prejudice for about 20 years. And yet, when I was doing this project, I realized that I had never had a serious conversation about reparations in my entire life. The first person I think who tried to engage me in such a serious conversation is actually one of the panelists today. It is Klarke Stricklen, who I think was very generous with me. I came to do a book talk at Oxford, and she sat with me and she said, "Would you like to talk about reparations?" And I said, sure. And I offered what I thought were intelligent and erudite concerns about the issue of reparations. And I think what's interesting when we talk about reparations, I think what's interesting is the things that we all agree on. We all agree that a great injustice has been done. You would have to be a monster not to think that. But I think, as Shabna pointed out, there is an overarching concern about the practicality, the realism, the forward-looking nature versus the backward-looking nature of reparations. So some of my erudite concerns, I thought, were, but who should pay for it? How could we possibly track down the funds? And in doing this project, I found out how much we already know about where the money has gone and where the money could come from. I thought, oh, but shall my children who are mixed race, how shall they handle paying for it? I don't know if they should be involved, not realizing that these are not questions that I'd come up with in some kind of interesting way, but this is part of a rhetoric that has been fed to us about the impracticality and impossibility of enacting reparations. I thought, how could this ever be practically done? And in the course of doing this particular project, I learned that other countries had already done this and done this to great success. And with every question I thought I had, and I have to really thank Klarke for her patience. She must have smiled and nodded as one smiles and nods with a particularly intelligent but ultimately not very well-informed child as I continued to say these things. And it is amazing how quickly you can learn. And what that showed me, because I don't think of myself, I hope I'm not in any way a particularly bad, difficult, or let's say a racist person. I'm not that kind of person. I'm trying actively to work towards an anti-racist future. And yet, if I could be so easily taken in by some of these concerns, it makes me worry about how easily other people could be as well, and how important this work therefore has to be. And so I would say there is no shame in admitting, as you come into this room, as you come into this project, that perhaps you have never had these serious conversations either. And what I would say is, if you have not had a chance to read the report, even after you listen to the panel, please do go through and read it. You'll find it incredibly illuminating, incredibly enlightening. You'll find that so many questions you might have had have been answered, and other questions you didn't even realize you had could also be answered. Questions about whether reparations are simply about the redistribution of money, questions about the continued financial system that still benefits the people who should never have benefited from reparations in the first place, questions about who actually got the first round of reparations, if you even realize there was a first round of reparations. There is so much to learn and so much to gather from this report and from this work. And of course, so much to gather from these panelists. So I'm very grateful for it, and I hope that you get as much out of it as I have got out of it. And the next time we talk about it, I hope that all of us in the room can move beyond that very easy conversation of acknowledging the great wrong that has been done in the past, but towards a much more solid, practical, and useful conversation about the great rights that we can do in the future. And with that said, I'm happy to hand over to Joseph, who will lead the panel discussion. So thank you very much, Joseph.
Thanks very much, Keon, and thanks, Shabna, and thanks to the Runnymede Trust for investing in this and believing in this, that this is a cause which is worth supporting. And as you said, Shabna, very much it feels like we can't just give up on this. In the current political climate, it feels that people need to know even more about Britain's history and why the inequalities are so cemented into British culture and British society and the economy and the global economy. Maybe just first, I'll just say a few words about myself. I'm the senior editor for diversity at The Guardian, but I also, kind of more relevant for this, I was also co-founder of The Guardian's own Legacies of Enslavement program. And that's a program which we've been now, has been in place to some extent for 5 years. When The Guardian first started looking back into its history, back in 2020 after questions were asked about the founders. After the Edward Colston statue was torn down in Bristol in 2020, questions started being asked about historic racism, not just modern day racism, in the aftermath of the murder of George Floyd. And when those questions came in, people asked about The Guardian, which was founded in 1821 in Manchester, a city which had made its wealth and made its money through cotton. And people wondered whether the Guardian founders had any links to cotton and therefore to slavery. And what we found, because the cotton was produced by enslaved people in the southern United States. And what we found, we commissioned an outside researcher from Dr. Cassandra Gupta, and she looked into it and found that not only the Guardian founder, John Edward Taylor, but all 9 of his 11 funders who we could trace had made their money in some way through cotton, which effectively meant through slavery, through the profits of slavery. And once we found that out, it took the whole project to another level, and we realized it was a kind of very important story for us to tell and to tell our readers. So I was then asked to draw up a plan of restorative justice action, which took another 2 years. And we divided it into journalism, doing a plan which helped Black journalists and gave opportunities to Black journalists, and also created new correspondent roles covering descendant communities across the Americas. Then we also felt that we should do some more work with other institutions in terms of spreading the word beyond just Guardian readers. So this was a story that would be known to a wider public. And also we did direct restorative justice action. We committed to doing direct restorative justice work with descendant communities in the United States, in Jamaica, and also in Brazil, where the cotton was grown, which produced the wealth which created The Guardian. So that's my involvement in that. And as I say, I'm co-founder of that project. It launched 2 years ago. Its editorial aspect, which was about telling our readers the story of this story in White Mattered, was called Cotton Capital, edited by my colleague Maya Wolf-Robinson. And that's been something which we've been kind of heavily involved in. The program we came up with is a 10-year program. So it's not something which is going to be fleeting. We're hoping that the changes that we make will embed themselves and be part of The Guardian, and also be embedded in among the descendant communities who we're working with in Jamaica and North and South America. So we are, and we're hoping that those changes will embed and become permanent changes, and that's been a real eye-opener working with descendant communities across in the Americas. So that's effectively why I have this interest, and why I've and like you said, Keon, it's been a very eye-opening journey for me too, learning so much more about from feeling I knew quite a bit about reparations, and realizing there's so much more to not only slavery and the slavery era, but why its legacy still lingers now, and why it's still an important issue for us to tackle today. But I'd like to go from now to sort of introducing our panelists, and I'm really delighted with such a great group of panelists who we've got to talk this evening. First of all, this is the order in which they'll be talking. First of all, Professor Kojo Koram, who teaches at the School of Law, Loughborough University, London. He writes on issues of law, race, and empire. He's the author of Uncommon Wealth, Britain and the Aftermath of Empire, which is a critically acclaimed book that examines how Britain's colonial past continues to shape its present-day legal and economic systems. Next, we'll be going to Klarke Stricklen. She's a doctoral student at the University of Oxford, and she's researching 19th century slavery and abolition in the Atlantic world. Her current research examines public discourse and political debates that culminated in the creation of the British Slave Compensation Programme in the 1830s. Next, we'll come to Nonhlanhla Makuyana. They are a Zimbabwean-born, UK-based community economist, educator, and community organizer. They are a co-director at Decolonizing Economics, where they work to cultivate a Black and people of color-led solidarity economy movement. They are the curator of Medicine, Lessons in Black Economic Interdependence, which is a project exploring how the African oral tradition can help communicate the relationships, tools, and skills essential for Black British economic self-determination. And finally, we come to Mary Ryder, who's the campaigns coordinator at the Transform Drug Policy Foundation, where she focuses on the racialized impacts of drug laws and advocates for reparative and social justice in drug policy reform. She's also a doctoral researcher at the University of Bristol, researching drug policy and transitional justice in Colombia. So that's our panelists. As you can see, there are a kind of really expert group of people who've got really interesting knowledge that they're bringing to this discussion. And I guess to start the conversation, I'd like to go to Professor Koram. I'd just like to know, first of all, what would you say to those who think reparations and the arguments about it and the campaigners are all just raking up the past, that it's 200 years old, that we don't need to talk about it now, we should think about the future? Professor Koram, what would you say to people like that?
Thank you, Joseph, and also thank you to Shabna Keon and everyone who's involved in this report and everyone who's joined tonight. I think the question that you put, it's the question that we often hear if ever you hear the conversation about reparations emerge in the media discourse, that this is something that happened hundreds of years ago. This is all about, I don't know, people in red coats and muskets in the 17th century. I think following the claim put forward by the Caribbean leaders of the Commonwealth, Nigel Farage responded by saying, well, Britain should be looking at colonization from the French, or, people should be always looking to this perpetual historical wrong. I think that completely misses the connection between the fundamental historical wrongs of plantation slavery and European colonization, particularly in the Caribbean, which we focus on, and the economic inequality that we see not only impoverishing people in those same regions in the 21st century, but also escalating inequality and economic instability all across the world today. When we look at the architecture that was put in place with European colonialism, and when we think about the British Empire, we have to think about the role that it played as the kind of fundamental lingua franca of the emergence of capitalism. We can look at the property laws, the tax laws, the debt laws that were put in place during colonialism. And those laws, many of them remain in place even deep into the 21st century. So when we talk about trying to advance causes like climate justice, we talk about things like debt relief, we talk about things like tax justice, restructuring some of the leading offshore financial centers in the world that just happen to be in former British colonies and ongoing British overseas territories like the BVI, like Bermuda, like the Cayman Islands. We can't take those questions seriously unless we want to talk about the question of righting those fundamental inequalities of plantation slavery and European colonialism, and looking to repair those inequalities. And so for anybody who's interested in kind of campaign projects that might have nothing to do with reparations, maybe even nothing to do with race, things like climate, things like debt, and that those could be perceived as not racial issues, but once you start tackling them, I think, in a serious way, you realize the importance of having to come to terms with this particular history. I think it's always important when we talk about reparations to really take that question of repair seriously. We're talking about essentially remaking the world as it functions at the moment. And I think if anybody looks around at the world and thinks, well, this isn't really operating as it needs to on an economic basis, then they should be open to the conversation about reparations in a forward, future-looking direction.
Thanks very much. I'd just like to maybe come back on that just quickly. People will say, but it is 200 years ago. People have had 200 years of freedom to sort themselves out. They've had even the nations that were colonized 60 plus years ago. Why is it that people haven't been able to sort of stand on their own 2 feet since?
Well, I think that is mistaking essentially what was kind of formal decolonization. And so we had the kind of symbols of decolonization. Countries that used to be colonial territories gained independence. They got their own flag, they got their own name, they got their own, nation state. But what they didn't get was substantive decolonization. They didn't get actual economic self-determination that was argued for again and again by many of those colonized countries. Look at the work of people like Michael Manley in Jamaica or Kwame Nkrumah in Ghana, who talked about how just having a flag and a national anthem wouldn't give them the ability to determine their own political future. And in the subsequent decades since, we've seen everything from, structural adjustment programs that further erode the independence of these countries, where they are given loans, but given conditions with those loans that mean that they cannot make their own interests in terms of their own self-interest, decisions in terms of their own self-interest. We can look at the impact of inequality in terms of the extraction of resources that continues to impoverish countries in the global south. We can see how real independence, real freedom isn't something that they've been able to actually experience. And part of the project of trying to engage seriously in reparation is thinking about what would be necessary to give these countries and these places the ability to mark out their own economic pathway.
Thanks very much, Kojo. A very good answer there. Clark, if I could come to you, I'm just really fascinated. We know more now that I think this slavery compensation program, which you are specializing in your research, was, if we go back maybe 10 years ago, was barely known about. It's become known when people have realized that the debt that was paid, or the compensation that was paid to enslavers, took so long and was so vast and took so long to pay off. But you've done a lot of research about that. So I'd just really be interested in how did it come to be that Britain decided to give 40% of its annual budget to compensate enslavers?
Right. Thank you. I just want to also preference by saying, my work was also guided by the UCL's British and Legacies of Slavery archive and compensation records. And so when I went back into the archive, I really wanted and still want to think about how British slave owners thought of compensation and what those kind of early conversations looked like, and if the public was engaged at all. And so I think where I start is that compensation was not a new point of engagement for a lot of people in the 19th century in the Atlantic world. And I think it becomes interesting when you get to debates within the Commons, because British slave owners and their representatives really wanted to start these abolition conversations off with affirming their private property rights. It was something that was happening in the colonies, and they needed to bring it to Britain to ensure that compensation was going to be on the table no matter what. It was just the means and the sum in which it was given and how it would be paid for. And that's really determined in 1823 with Canning's resolution, where they know that slavery is ultimately going to end, but they're trying to ensure that when it does end, compensation will be facilitated. And so I think from here, debates, especially when you get into kind of public articles about how people in Britain feel about compensation, but also kind of pro-slavery articles and thinking about it, we see that some people who are signing petitions for the anti-slavery societies are also saying that they're willing to contribute to compensation to a certain degree. And some slave owners are also asking, when petitions are basically presented within the Commons, whether or not those people who are signing their names on those documents are willing to participate and give their fair kind of contribution to slave compensation. This was kind of slave owners reviewed as the facilitators of a system that the entire empire benefited off of. And so the public, if it was going to be a national problem to kind of end slavery, then the public was going to have to contribute to its end.
And how did that? I mean, that's a big ask, isn't it, to expect the public to contribute? How did that manage to pass?
Right. So I'm finding within kind of the archival base of kind of the last negotiations of the abolition plan, the members of parliament take it upon themselves to say, if this is something that the public wants, then it will ultimately become the burden of the public to kind of pay for that. And they see it as not necessarily a problem because the public has been advocating against the end of slavery for so long.
And this is really interesting because up till recently, as I was saying, people probably thought that 1807 was the big moment of the end of Britain's involvement in slavery, the William Wilberforce abolition of the slave trade. And people, that was kind of widely celebrated the bicentenary in 2007. And why is it important that we know this other story about 1833, Klarke?
Right. Well, I think the larger story has been that, Britain led in this movement for abolition. I think one of the quotes that I was looking for right before I kind of logged on today was one from one of the last negotiations. And one of the parliamentarians talked about that the world was watching what they were doing, and that what they did here would be followed by other countries who were facing the same problem of slavery. And so I think if we are going to talk about Britain being a leader in abolition, we have to add nuance to that story and really talk about the means in achieving abolition and how compensation was really central to that mission. And that was continued in other formats within countries who were getting rid of slavery themselves.
And Klarke, I just wanted to ask as well. I should just say thankfully, we're joined by Bell Ribeiro-Addy, the chairman of the All-Party Parliamentary Group on African Reparations. I think, Bell, it's been quite a busy day for you, so we may have to go to you now. Bell used to be, I'm very proud to welcome Bell. She's also used to be my MP when she was MP for Streatham, but thankfully, unfortunately, we had boundary changes, and Bell's no longer my own MP, but she thankfully got re-elected for Clapham and Brixton. But Bell, if you would be okay to say some words now?
Thank you very much, and thank you to everybody on the call, and obviously, of course, the Runnymede Trust for ensuring that this goes ahead. Sometimes there is a big concern that people start to move away from discussions on reparations. As global events happen, we may be talking about reparations for a period of time, and then people seem to stop. So I think there's nothing more important than making sure that we keep reparations on the agenda. Now, I'm really pleased in Parliament to be able to have the opportunity to chair the All-Party Parliamentary Group on African reparations, and I think it's vital because in those race relations spaces, we're able to engage on issues of discussions of reparations. Now, one of the problems that we do have, however, is that people think that some people do say things such as why are we talking about reparations? Enslavement is in the past. We should just be talking about race relations, about racial justice. That is where the issues are, and I think people don't understand, or some people don't understand, just how they go hand in hand, and actually really how challenging discrimination is a part. Racial discrimination is a part of reparations, not that one is more important than the other. And that's so important to understand, because we have to understand that the context within which we exist today, which is in that racist society, was shaped by our past, and all of those centuries of enslavement and colonial extraction have really shaped our inequalities. And recognizing this and naming what caused the issues we face today isn't divisive or radical. It's actually just crucial to repairing and addressing injustice. One of the things that I find myself doing here often in this house is trying to explain to people that the idea of reparations isn't actually a radical one. Trying to explain to them that it's actually a moral obligation, and it is quite simple. When you cause harm, you take responsibility. When you take something, you give it back. It's things that are and concepts that should be really as simple as that. And we can't really speak about justice in Britain without addressing the crimes against humanity that really we built so much of our nation's wealth on. And we can't claim to value equality if we actually refuse to reckon with those legacies and those crimes. And apologies, whilst they might be welcome on their own, it aren't enough. Though we do have to note that an official apology has yet to be issued on behalf of the British monarchy or the government. Unfortunately, my government persistently say that Tony Blair made an apology in, I'm trying to remember which year it was. He didn't make an apology. He expressed deep regret, and that is very different. And I always say I don't think that deep regret is the type of sentiment that you express for something as heinous as the transatlantic slave trade. I mean, I deeply regret how late I was for my first meeting this morning, and how late I still am for this meeting. That's the type of thing that you express deep regret for. Or the fact that Woolworths has closed. I know it closed a very long time ago, but some of us are still feeling that pain. That is not the type of thing that you express deep regret for. The enslavement and trafficking of peoples of African descent, it should really invoke so much more than that. And when these words do come, and I hope they do, they really do have to lead to action, because we've seen in some European countries that they have come, and they've come and they've gone. And it's really important to understand that, when the transatlantic slave trade ended, you saw the UK rush to be the first to end it, and now that's the thing that we say a lot. We say that the UK ended the slave trade, and we should be given credit for that. But that is part and parcel of what we need reparations for. We really need to correct that history and make people understand that it was peoples of African descent that actually brought about an end to their own enslavement. They began to rebel so much that the slave trade was no longer economically viable. That's what began to bring an end to it. And then it was the same with colonialism. When it got to a point where these countries in Africa and the Caribbean and the Indian subcontinent began to want to govern themselves, what happened? All of a sudden, you saw the monarchy coming to do ceremonies to give them back the country as if it was theirs to give in the first place. And and so on and so forth. So that we have to, when it comes to reparations, get to a place where I suppose those that did the harm are not dictating the terms. And that, it just, what we call it, neo-colonialism, it just keeps going on. There just always seems to be a new way in which to control the narrative, and actually to control what was meant to be justice and or freedom. Now, it's important to understand that reparations isn't just about large financial sums, and you'll hear people talk about large amounts of money, and sometimes when people hear a figure, their minds instantly switch off, and this is really problematic, because then they start going down ridiculous roads about how, are we going to ask for reparations from the Romans, as if the Roman Empire still exists and the effects of the Roman Empire still exist, and they attempt to undermine our calls for reparations in this way. And for me, as a member of Parliament, particularly living in a cost of living crisis, people's living standards are falling, which, in my personal view, is due to political decisions. But people will say, why are you opting or looking to pay reparations to people, and people in this country are suffering? But we need to understand that the call for reparations is far broader, it's far deeper, and it's far transformative than just simple checks. If we were to just give a check to any country, we wouldn't solve their problems, because the whole system of enslavement and the racial injustice that has subsequently followed it, and the colonialism, neo-colonialism, was all built on capitalism. It's all about control. And if we are to go about reparations, we have to go to the root of the word and actually go about true repair. And that is about bringing equality on many levels. If we were to just give a country a check before we know that money would find itself recycled back into the West, it's as problematic as aid has become. And, these arguments that often come against anything that has to do with reparative justice. So I think about the issues when it comes to restitution and returning artifacts and things, that those ideas of not being able to take care of things yourself, not being trusted, not being able to keep things safe, spouting those types of concerns. They are all based on peoples of African descent not having their own autonomy to be able to decide how their repair is meant to happen. And those are the types of things that we really need to make sure that we challenge in the space of reparations. Because even if we do get to a point where people are discussing these issues, it is so easy for it to slide into a situation where we, who are most affected, are not dictating the terms. And it's so important that we address those different legacies. And now I've said a lot, and I'm going to listen to what people are saying and talking. And I also want to talk about the conference that the All Party Parliamentary Group are having at the end. But I'm really, really sad to have missed some of the speakers that have come before, and I'm really looking forward to some of the speakers that we're going to hear now. So thank you, Joseph. I want to hand back over to you, who is expertly chairing in place of my very tardy self.
Thanks very much, Bell. It's great that you were able to contribute. Obviously, I know it's a much busier week and a much busier day that you've had than you were expecting when this thing was organised, with a tube strike thrown in just for the lols. I'd just like maybe to change the order slightly, because I think I'd like to give the audience a chance to put a question or two directly to you, Bell. And we do have a question which has come through. They haven't given the name. I don't have the name, but they're asking. It's in a way it follows on from what you were saying, and maybe a specific thing when we were talking about Labour and where Labour Party is right now. How do we tackle the conversation and avoid the backlash of deprived communities within Britain when asking for reparations?
Well, one of the things that I'm definitely trying to do with my colleagues is make them understand. So some people won't be sold on the moral arguments, and that's sad, but it's true. I think we need to explain to people that world systems, or the world itself, is changing, and it may take a bit longer, but peoples of African descent will change their circumstances with or without us, and we need to understand whether or not it's going to be without us. Quite often, I find myself arguing against the government putting in more money into defence than they do into welfare, for example. And that's because they say, we're going to face big threats in the future. We're going to face threats from China and Russia. And I think to myself, what is it that China and Russia are doing? If you think they are the biggest threat to you, what is it you think they're doing right now? And they are investing in Africa and the Caribbean and South America. They are all over it, and they are doing it. I'm not saying completely altruistically. I'm sure that you've probably all heard certain issues have arisen, but they're doing it in a way that Western governments have not done it, and they're doing it without necessarily having the links and the shared the shared language and the shared history. So I suppose in that, the point I'm trying to make is that we need to be careful that we as a country do not get squeezed out of countries that we already have good relations with. I think sometimes people think because they go on diplomatic visits and people are very nice to them in these particular countries, and we have that shared language, that there's a lot of love. And I can tell you that if you speak to particularly the younger generations, there's a lot of bitterness, there's a lot of anger, there's a lot of new understanding now that we've unearthed so many histories about how much has been stolen from them. There's a lot of resentment. And we need to quickly get on the train of, being more contrite, being more apologetic, and being more understanding that if we don't start looking at people as equals, they will soon not be our friends. In about 40 to 50 years, 1 in 4 people in this country is going to be over 65, and 50% of the world's young people are going to be on the African continent. Now, I personally would not like 50% of the world's young people to hold resentment towards my country and this country. And I think people need to understand that it's as much about our security and securing friends, particularly in a situation where we don't have the trade links that we used to have, as it is about doing the right thing. Sometimes doing the right thing can actually be in the best interests of yourself. And in that case, it's definitely the best interests of the UK.
Yeah, thanks very much, Bill. I just maybe like to follow that up by saying, if we've all seen what's happened in Britain this summer, and in fact even last summer, but even aside from that, how would you explain to a white working class person that that part of their taxes should go towards compensating black people on the other side of the world, when they will think they never got the benefit of this white system of wealth that was created, that the enslavers managed to benefit from?
It is about education and making them understand that they have benefited in some way. And that's one of the things that we don't do. We don't educate our population, and actually we don't ever educate ourselves as peoples of African descent. We do not know everything. And that's one, a failing of the education system, but I suppose it's also a failing of the system in which you live. History is written by the victors, and nobody wanted to write this really horrible past. But I think it's about explaining to them what went wrong. And again, it's about looking at how we go about paying reparations. Now, I'm not saying that there will be no money involved, but we have to start in ways that make sense. We have to start with creating more equal systems before we put money into the situation. Or, in my view, there's no point in putting money into the situation in the first place. I just don't believe that handing over large sums of money when a country already has debts, which should be cancelled first, because that is a form of reparations, is the way to instantly deal with the situation.
Thanks very much, Bell. And thanks for taking questions. Really appreciate that. And it's great to have you, as I say, on such a busy day for you. And it's great that you can be here to hear this discussion. I am going to thanks very much. I don't know how long you can stay for, Bell, but hopefully you'll be able to hear a little bit of this discussion anyway. But we appreciate that you're very busy. Nonhlanhla, I was going to come to you. And just following on from the really interesting essay that you wrote for the reparations report, you say, as Bell was saying as well, that reparations are not merely about monetary compensation. I just wonder what other things you think we should be thinking of when it comes to reparations.
So I think the reason why I say this in my article is because within the economic system, we tend to think of things within the materialist framing of, we think about numbers and therefore numbers show us scale. And, when we think about the impact of slavery, the thing that shocks people most is when we talk about like how many enslaved people went through the system, but actually in the same time, and also when we also think about how much money is needed to be commiserate to the lives that were lost, I find that can be quite problematic, I guess, because it's sort of reducing the lives of so many people to a monetary value. And I think it also speaks as well to the silence of African people's experiences during the slave trade. So, during the slave trade, people's life experience was like life expectancy was around 7 years. And there's a lot of like grief and loss attached to that I think unites a lot of like African descendant people across the world. So in Brazil, they have a word for this called banzo, which speaks to like the deep nostalgia and grief that people feel as a result of the historic, the historic loss that happened and everyone experienced as well. And I think this really speaks to how African people were made into commodities and has inscribed that is inscribed within the system of racial capitalism, that we are not people, we are commodities. And even in the archives, we're written about as goods and not as people. And there's just this complete dehumanization that exists. And I think in my essay, I write about this in terms of like exploring the levels of grief and loss that is needed to be processed as a people. And for that reclamation of us as people, as opposed to enslaved people or as commodities or as workers, but as actual people that live lives and have lots of like life to also continuously live. And so I think in my article, I was writing what that really, really looks like within this conversation of reparations is the need to sort of reclaim our being in terms of what was lost as a result of slavery, which looks a lot like technologies that existed within our community. So within my work as an community economist, the ways in which people were functioning within the economy outside of slavery or outside of capitalism before and continue to. So like non-market exchange, like partners, susus, or which are like ways of collectively saving, or ways in which people were growing food to look after each other, or ways in which people were like looking after each other that didn't rely on capitalism as well. And those systems just were lost. And when we think about reparations, I think it's a project of how are we able to reclaim those technologies that exist within our cultures as African people to continue towards like self-determination that we were robbed of historically and continue to be robbed of today. And I think lastly with that is when we also think about reparations is that lots of people today still experience that lack of self-determination. Like lots of the communities I work with still have problems with getting housing, or are struggling with like safety, security. And those are things that were inscribed within the economy as a death-making institution as a result of slavery. And I think there's some work there to be done around like, how can we collectively reclaim our being, and how can we use our own knowledge, cultural systems to be able to meet that our collective needs within the system as well.
Thanks very much. I think that's just that the idea that we need to reclaim our being is such a powerful idea, and it speaks to so many things. Thanks so much, Nonhlanhla. That's really interesting. I'd like to come to Mary now. Mary is the, as I mentioned earlier, is the campaigns coordinator at Transform Drug Policy Foundation. And just to put to you, because people might be thinking, oh, what's that got to do with reparations? But as you say in your essay, when the war on drugs was being rolled back and in the places where it is, the harm it's caused, that this war caused, is being recognised, and which it does open the door to restorative justice conversations. I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the wider about how you think the wider reparations movement can learn from this experience.
Yeah, of course. Thank you, Joseph. I think that's a really important question. And I also want to start by saying that I think it's really significant to see that drug policy reform in 2 papers in this report, and that is being seriously included in sort of the wider conversation around reparations here, because prohibition itself was built through a colonial architecture and a racial imperative, a racist imperative that continues to cause harm globally, particularly among Black and racially minoritized communities. But these harms are felt most and really disproportionately by marginalized communities across the globe. And at Transform, when we talk about ending the war on drugs, we're talking about introducing new legislation that would bring about a system of legal state regulation. So this isn't an end in itself, but it's about building a fairer and safer society. So we've been asking things like, how can those most harmed by prohibition benefit from legal regulation? And specifically, how can these new legal markets create opportunities, economic and otherwise, for excluded and marginalized communities? So, yeah, as you say, as this becomes sort of a reality across the world, a key lesson I think that we can take from these early experiences is that repair has to go beyond simply ending the harmful policy. And it requires, well, firstly, deliberately sort of recognizing these harms, but then it's about structural repair. And in this case, actively building social justice and equity into the new system that replaces them. And I think a really interesting example is New York State in the US, where cannabis legalization was initially opposed by activists in 2019 because it wasn't considered to be reparative enough. And then it was redesigned and a new law was passed in 2021 that really tried to maximize its reparative potential. And this included things like social equity measures to remove barriers to accessing the market. So things like priority licenses for people with criminal convictions under prohibition, financial assistance, training and technical advice, and support to access the market. as well as reinvestment of tax revenues, I think at 50%, into education, public health, housing. It's not a perfect model, but it shows the possibilities and opportunities to be had. And I discuss these learnings in more depth in the paper, but just two more points that I really want to highlight. First, is the automatic expungement of criminal records, which I think seems obvious, but is not inevitable. And there are places across the globe now where people are continuing to suffer the harms of having a criminal record for cannabis possession or selling, yet it's no longer legal, and people are even becoming very wealthy from this new market. We also think that this should be automatic so that the onus isn't on the individual, but rather the state, so that that person doesn't have to go through what could be quite a re-traumatizing process. And secondly, we think power sharing is really important, and this means that affected communities or communities that have suffered disproportionately under prohibition are involved in and actually leading the design, implementation, and evaluation of these new frameworks, so that the policies genuinely meet their needs and creates real opportunities for people to participate in and genuinely benefit from these new markets. And I just want to end by saying that new legal drug markets or emerging legal drug markets are potentially really lucrative, and we really need to be amplifying this conversation around their social justice and reparative potential, to ensure that these reforms don't just benefit a small number of already wealthy and powerful individuals and would therefore reproduce kind of existing inequalities in society. And I think that if we can centre social justice, inequity and reparation in the design of these markets, that can show leadership more broadly for other sectors.
Thanks very much, Mary. I just really like what you said there about, you pointed out that people who are still suffering from their past cannabis convictions or cannabis possession convictions are still suffering from them, even while other people are profiting from the new markets. And that so speaks to the ending of slavery. I mean, the fact that the injustices are so embedded while new people who are in a position to make profits and really thrive in the new environment. I'd just to say I've got a couple more questions myself, but if you would, we've already had some people put questions in the Q&A, but I'm about to go over to the Q&A in a couple of minutes. So if anyone in the audience would like to add questions for the Q&A section, please do that now. I guess I'd just like to go back to each of you in turn and just ask, what aspects of reparations do you think are most poorly understood at the moment? And what do you think of all the different arguments and issues about reparations, what do you think it's most important for the public to understand better? I'll start with you, Klarke.
Thank you. I want to agree that, reparations, it's not necessarily all about the money. I think people tend to view it as, some people have a misconception that it's a money grab, but I do want to emphasize the importance of compensation and really being able to realize the programs and initiatives that we need to be able to have this program, the development of educational initiatives and further research into slavery and resulting systems of harm, alleviating the racial wealth gap, and even the facilitation of the reparations program by staff and administrators will require monies from a compensation fund to do. And so I just hope that, with the articles that we have within this publication and more kind of information that comes out, the public and, our critics will see that these numbers are important. They're an investment, and importantly, they're kind of a journey toward the future and, where Britain will be in this next generation.
Thanks very much. Nonhlanhla.
I think one thing that I feel like is really necessary, or like people sometimes misunderstand, is like the need for spaces for like cultural memory. And I think especially given that there's a lot of silence around like Black people's experiences of enslavement and like the impacts of that since. Like there's not a lot of like physical spaces within the UK where people can actually see that with their own eyes and reckon with that history and like experience that history. And I think something that is misunderstood is the urgency and the need for spaces for people to collectively archive those experiences into a collective, because I think especially in the UK, it's as if we never existed, right? And I think there's a really urgent need to create those spaces that make sure that mark our existence and that mark our connections with people across the world and across history.
Thanks very much. And Mary?
I think a really important thing for me is that it's about transforming the conditions that have allowed some of these harms to happen in the first place. In the context of drug policy, that means recognizing that prohibition and criminalization are a legacy of colonial control and has systematically targeted and excluded certain communities. So understanding that harms like the trauma of criminalization, mass criminalization, stigmatization of whole communities, the long-term impacts of a criminal record, which goes on to affect housing, employment, education, are part of this legacy. And then it's about ensuring that new laws, new policies can actively repair the damage. And I think what we've been saying, it's about imagining new, better futures. I just also wanted to make a point about the sort of the scale of the opportunity that drug policy reform presents here. A recent Transform report found that legal regulation of cannabis alone could generate up to £1.5 billion a year in net benefits for the Treasury through tax revenue and criminal justice savings, and it could create over 15,000 jobs across cultivation, manufacturing, retail, related businesses. And I think it is a really exciting and perhaps unprecedented or unparalleled chance to not only end these harms, but to deliver reparative justice through wealth and power redistribution, and try, as we're saying, to build a fairer society.
Thanks very much, Ray. Before going to Q&A, I just wanted to come back to Klarke on one thing that you mentioned in your essay, but it does tie into some of the way the other conversations have gone. And sorry, I should point out to everyone that Professor Koram has had to leave early, unfortunately. So we're not going to be able to hear from him later on. But it's just been really great to have his contribution earlier. Klarke, you mentioned in your essay this notion of black idleness, which was one of those things that was used to justify the fact that black people couldn't be given their freedom back in the 19th century. And you also talked about how that notion hadn't disappeared in the 1830s. I was wondering if you could just say a little bit more about that and sort of why those kind of stereotypes have been so damaging over the years. And in a way, it speaks to the idea of, Nonhlanhla's idea of reclaiming our being.
Right. Thank you. Yeah, I think when you're in the archive and you see talks of Black idleness, I think I tend to kind of look at the record and look at what that means. And it's directly tied to this kind of perceived idea of productivity. So how much they feel like this apprentice laborer, now this free laborer, is working, and how much they feel like they should be working versus how much they already are. And I think historians who are particularly focused on slave societies in the Caribbean have directly correlated that to resistance, and enslaved people really continuing to resist even after receiving freedom, but also not being kind of placed in these systems of economic kind of injustice and refusing to exert the maximum amount of labor that those now landowners expect of them with such little pay. And so Professor Catherine Hall has done a lot of work on kind of tying some of these post-emancipation kind of tropes and this failure of emancipation that are kind of lodged within the kind of colonial knowledge hubs of Oxford and Cambridge, to kind of the sentiments that meet those persons of Caribbean heritage once they come to Britain and are now kind of working in this kind of mixed race environment.
Okay, thanks very much. I'm now going to go to audience questions, and there's one which is particularly troubling. I won't give the person's name, but they say they were, until a couple of weeks ago, under the misguided belief that reparations were the consequence of long past historical legacies and crimes. 2 weeks ago, this person says, I was at Warwick University's campus to find gollywog characters for sale. It was part of the Friends of Rupert Bear annual conference. Today, my therapy session was about the destructive mental health impact of this. I've been called gollywog as a child, teenager, and as an adult. Frequently, I'm in therapy due to racism that impacts not only through my experiences, but also intergenerationally through the experiences of indenture for my grandparents and how my memories of them and how my memories of them communicating their experiences to me and seeing the pain and trauma expressed through their actions. Does reparations, this person asks, cover the continuation of racialized trauma and violence stemming from enslavement? Maybe Nonhlanhla, that would be one for you to talk about.
Thank you so much for this question, and I'm sorry that this happened to you. And I feel like that is something that a lot of like Black people have experienced. And also, I think I really recommend everybody to read about banzo. It's like the term that they use in Brazil to express this feeling. And I feel like reparations should cover the continuation of racialized trauma and the violence stemming from it, because I think, you know, the whole existence of racism is that it separates people. And I think in Black Marxism, they talk a lot about this, of just like the making of the slave. When you make the slave, you destroy a person's like personhood. And I think systems in the UK continue to do that. Systems globally continue to do that. And I think reparations should really, yeah, cover like, you know, because some people also call this like complex post CPTSD. I don't know the fancy way of saying it, but like it's post-traumatic trauma that is carried intergenerationally, and that there's been studies showing that it even changes people's like biological makeup, the experiences of racism. And I think I'm so glad you brought this to the fore, because I feel like there's so many people that are experiencing these things. And I feel like that's another part that is missing in terms of like how are we organizing with the knowledge that we all experience this? How should that be part of our demands as well, of just like capacity for healing collectively and individually as well?
Thanks very much. Klarke or Mary, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, I'll just add shortly, just agreeing with everything that was previously said, but also thinking about, you know, reparations, and kind of really breaking down these racist kind of narratives that people continue to have to deal with in their everyday lives. And a lot of that work will be narrative work. A lot of that work will start with the kind of creation of where these narratives come from, research done by universities, and just public scholars who are able to break this down for the public so that in their everyday lives they can pick out things that may stem from these legacies, so that they can be in communities where they're not harmful to others.
Thanks very much. Maybe I'll go to just, it's more a contribution than a question from Wanda Wiporska, who's from the Black Equity Organization. She says, we also need to think about how we can use genealogy and our Black family history as a tool for reparations. She says the slave registers and the compensation records sometimes allow us to identify the enslavers of our ancestors. That's very true. And we've people like David Harewood have gone back to Harewood House to talk to the Lascelles family about, you know, directly connecting. And then there are other groups like the heirs of slavery who have benefited from the proceeds of slavery and the profits of it, that they're now willing to do something to atone for the sort of historic injustice. There's someone's asked here, an interesting question here, which is one that does come up from time to time, and certainly in some parts of the Caribbean. How do we talk about reparations and historical slavery linking to racial justice without alienating Asian communities that also experience colonialism and racialized systems, but not slavery? Maybe Klarke, maybe you could answer that.
I think that's an important question, and I think it's kind of pivotal to this claim that CARICOM holds, because I think when you kind of read through the 10-point plan for reparatory justice, you find that this reparations program is for the citizens of the Caribbean. And so I think that is inclusive of everyone who experienced colonization, even, after this period of slavery, and you have this apprenticeship period, and then you see the kind of trafficking of persons of Chinese and Asian heritage. And so I would just say perhaps there needs to be a better narrative or kind of conversations on this kind of inclusive call within that respect.
Nonhlanhla, did you have thoughts on that?
Yeah, I really agree with everything that Clark said as well. And I feel like reparations, as it helps us to think about the ways in which the economic system has functioned to be harmful for everyone and in different ways. And I think there needs to be some work of sort of understanding how, yeah, we were all impacted by the colonialism and empire. And sometimes our experiences are different and sometimes our experiences are quite similar, but that it's actually instead of like fighting with each other about how those things happened, is actually fighting the people that created that system and in the ways that they pit us against each other. And also, yeah, create this idea that that there's a competition and a scarcity that exists when there's actually an abundance for everyone. And I think there's something about how do we challenge this system and the ways in which it impacted us all, in different ways.
Thanks. And Mary, do you think there's a lesson from the kind of drug reparative justice that we could learn from that in terms of bringing different communities together?
Well, I think drug policy reform, or thinking about reparative justice within drug policy reform, does open up the conversation more broadly, because I think for me, it's quite difficult to think about drug policy reform kind of nation by nation because of the histories behind these policies, right? And sorry to keep talking about drugs, but I think if, for example, if the UK were to legalize, say, cannabis alone, what does this mean for farmers in Jamaica, Morocco, Colombia, things like that? So I think in that sense, there's a lot we can learn about opening up these conversations globally and thinking about what inclusive reparation looks like.
Okay. Thanks very much. I need to correct myself. Sorry, apologies. Wanda, who I mentioned earlier, is not the head of the Black Equity Organisation. She's the former head of the Black Equity Organisation. So I'm pleased I've got time to correct myself on that. Serena Robinson asks, I really like the idea of collectively reclaiming our being, but can you give some suggestions on how this can be done? And Nonhlanhla, I guess I should come to you for that.
Yeah, so I am in a lot of the groups that I'm part of. Lots of people work around the use of rituals and even oral histories within our organizing work. So, for example, Land in Our Names, when they start their meetings or their organizing, they'll do a ritual where they'll remember all the people that have come before them and all the people that are going to come after. And then it's just the space of remembrance, I think, is a really big part of remembering your being. And I think there's also another part of just within the system that we live in, as we've seen within what's happening in Gaza, there's just not a lot of space to actually sit down and grieve the extent of the loss. And I think, how can we reclaim our being when we're also experiencing just the magnitude of all the people that are just being lost within the system as well? And I think one thing that really works, I think, is a good grief practice of just remembering the people that you're connected to that have been gone, and remembering your relationships to them, and that being a consistent practice within our organizing.
Thanks very much. I'd like to get other panelists' thoughts on that. Do you have quick thoughts, either Clark or Mary, on that? Very quick thoughts? Yeah.
Yes, just to quickly add, a lot of that is also just memory work. When we look at the archive, and especially with some of the kind of plantations kept detailed archives, especially of those enslaved people were baptized and became Christians, we know their names and we know their former names, and being able to really document that. A lot of it's also genealogy to help with that memory work, and to kind of figure out what you can know of those stories, which a lot of historians are working on, and people who are doing their genealogies continue to kind of look for those tiny instances where they can find a piece of information about their family members.
Thanks very much, Clark. Sorry, we've run out of time for the questions now. Really, thanks for everyone who posted a question, and apologies to all the people who I didn't have a chance to get to. But and now it's been a really interesting discussion with everyone. Bell having time to come to be part of this. Professor Koram, Nonhlanhla, Clark, Mary. But thanks everyone for all your contributions and to everyone who's asked a question. But now I'd like to pass back to Shabna. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Joseph. Actually, you've done an amazing job with scrambling through what was a fairly kind of hairy schedule, particularly with kind of having to change from the in-person event to the online in such a hurry. So thank you to everyone for the conversation. Actually, such an important and powerful conversation. I guess what I feel a responsibility to say something about where Runnymede Trust will take this work and move it going forward. And I think that so many of the questions that were asked about speak to this idea. And Bell, I think that I can see Bell's just rejoined us as well. So much of this work has been ongoing for a very long time. Runnymede Trust is not kind of pioneering this. We are joining this conversation, and we know that there's a huge backbone of organizations and people who have kept this conversation alive for a long time. For us, in terms of moving this forward, we are very, very clear that we're not just kind of talking about the compensation and the need for that. For us, it very much is going to inform all of the kind of policy work and the policy development that we do, whether that's in kind of thinking about wealth redistribution, whether it's thinking about health and the point they're made there about the way in which racism impacts on our kind of health and physical well-being, thinking about our education system and how the education system needs to change. All of these are areas where Runnymede Trust has always worked, and we will take what we have learned through the work, through colleagues, both on this call and who contributed to the report more widely, to help that shape some of the way in which we kind of pursue that through that wider policy work that we're doing. And for us, very much so, this is not about a competitive gain or an exclusive gain for people of colour. We absolutely recognise it must acknowledge and be that, but it must also be speaking to the wider inequalities that are kind of created by the architectures of the past, of slavery, of colonialism, and that those architectures are still current and persistent now, and those architectures need to change in that context. So that is where Runnymede Trust intends to take the work forward. We don't do that as one organisation that can kind of do this alone. We know we do this in partnership with many, many others who are already doing this work. And just one, in fact, no, I won't say anything else because I'm going to hand it back to Professor Keon West, who actually has come to the Runnymede Trust and taken this on as his first big project with us. And I am so grateful for his leadership on this as well. So I'll hand it back to you, Keon.
Great. Thank you so much. And also, I'd like to thank everyone on the panel. So I'd like to thank Clark. I'd like to thank Nonhlanhla. I'd like to thank Mary. I'd like to thank Kojo, even though he's not here. And I'd really like to thank Joseph, who, as Shabna said, has done brilliantly navigating changing schedules. I understand that we're all online and they cannot hear you, but if you could give them a round of applause, because I think it's been an absolutely brilliant panel. Somewhere in the universe, it will still make a difference. I'd like to hand over for a final word to MP Bell Ribeiro-Addy, who'd like to say one other thing before we close the meeting. Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you very much. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
Ah, amazing. And thank you so much to everybody. And thank you for being so accommodating, and for Joseph for taking over my chairing role. I wasn't able to listen to all of the meeting, but what I did listen to was so important. And I always like to explain to people that education is such a huge part of reparations, and every time I attend some form of reparations meeting, I learn something new, which means there is just so much more for us to learn. There's so much more work for us to do, and I'm just really pleased that the work continues in any setting. Now, one of the things that the All-Party Parliamentary Group for African Reparations will be doing is holding its national conference on the 18th of October. That particular week is also the anniversary of the Pan-African Conference that was held in Manchester. One of the conferences that sparked a lot of the end to colonial struggles, and one of the first calls for reparation that was attended by Kwame Nkrumah and Amy Garvey. And one of the people that will be there actually is Dr. Julius Garvey, who is the son of Marcus Garvey and Amy Garvey, and he will be there, and that will be the first panel in terms of talking about Pan-Africanism. But one of the main reasons for this conference is to bring the reparations movement in the UK together. There are so many people doing different bits of work, and there are also so many people that actually have some different views about how we go about achieving and delivering reparations. The most important thing, though, is that we come together and we share those ideas and ideals, that we learn more and that we move forward, particularly for those of us in Parliament that need to understand how we're moving forward in terms of creating policy. So I am inviting all of you to come, and I'll definitely send some more information Runnymede's way, and actually some more questions about how Runnymede and other organisations can help. Thank you again so much. People keep telling me that reparations is not achievable, and that we're talking about it a lot, and it's not something that's going to happen. But I always remind them that was a point in time that people thought that the enslavement of peoples of African descent would never end, and that the countries that they were colonized would never be governed by themselves, and even that Black people would never be in Parliament. But now I literally get the opportunity to stand in that place where people said that people that look like me could be owned, and call for reparations. So the wheels of justice, what do they say? They grind exceedingly fine, but they do grind indeed. I think I've got that quote slightly wrong, but I think you all get my drift. Things change. We just have to keep fighting. I have a colleague that says they don't call it the struggle for nothing.
Great. Thank you so much. I'm afraid it falls to me to say the very last things and to close out the meeting. I would once again like to thank everyone at the Runnymede Trust who contributed to this work. Stephen, Violetta, Rohini, Sophia, all the people at Runnymede who've contributed to this. I think it's been a fantastic report and a fantastic event. And then just in the last 60 seconds or 120 seconds before I close out, I would like to note some of my own emotions. I tend not to use emotions very much as decision-making processes. I like to use facts. But as I listened to the panel, there was something that was deeply emotionally wrenching about the things that you were saying. And it wasn't always the things that might initially be perceived as most emotional. I think sometimes these are the things that seem straightforward and practical and simple. The fact that there are people in prison for selling cannabis when cannabis is legal. Such a simple fact, but such a wrenching one. And I realized that part of the wrenching might be wrestling with the realization, exactly as Bell said, that what we are discussing is not radical. It is simple, practical, moral, and achievable. And I wrestle with that part of me that fears leaving my comfort zone and actually just asking for it. And if there's something I plan to take from this project and that I continue to take from the panel, it's the simple, practical morality of what we are saying. And it is the belief that we can accomplish this if we just decide to. So with that, I'd like to thank everyone for their part in this. I hope everyone has a wonderful evening. Thank you so much for coming, and we'll continue the work.